Today, I've invited Jill Shaw to a Zoom recording for broadcast. Jill, a warm welcome and hi to my tour radio program.
Kia ora, it's great to be here.
Jill Shaw is a Christian chaplain at Massey University, offering spiritual support to people of all faiths and none. Currently, Jill is part of a disability inclusive project that is called Inclusive Faith. Behind the project are the Ministry of Social Development, the Ministry for Disabled People, Yes Disability, Inclusive Aotearoa Collective, and the Religious Diversity Center, the RDC. Jill introduced the project in an interview with me last year, and this interview is still available on the RDC YouTube channel. Jill, can you just give us a brief about the goal of this project?
We just want to create a norm where people with any kind of impairment, any kind of a disability or condition or challenges that would inhibit them from worshiping fully in a faith community, that it would just be the norm that hospitality would be extended to them just the same as anybody else. So we're trying to change the norm.
What do you mean with hospitality?
When we first started the project, we called it the Inclusive Faith Project. There were different ideas thrown around, and we had to settle on a name, of course. But over the course of the project, from our first hui in Palmerston North at the end of June, all the way through meetings in Dunedin, Wellington, Christchurch, a couple of them here in Auckland, a couple of them online, Hamilton, the Waikato, we've learned things. So in a way, I really wish that we hadn't used inclusive, as far as the name of the thing, because when we include someone, this is one of the things that a genius man down in Christchurch taught us. When we include someone, it still leaves the power with me or with the person who's doing the including or excluding. And that's not really how faith communities should operate. Hey, it should be that there's hospitality. And as he said, if you include me, it means you're already sitting around the table and you make space for me. But if I belonged at that table and I'm not there, you will notice.
It's more like a reminder to the part of the community that doesn't realize that they are part of the community.
Exactly.
It's like a
it's
reminder.
About belonging, yeah. Yes. And not including or excluding. And so to take the power element out of it a little bit, that was just revolutionary for me. It was just such a sweet learning from Christchurch.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's what you need for these projects, to have people with honesty who tell you what their problem with a term is, because it starts with a name.
Yeah, their lived experience informed so much of this project. Yeah.
And last time in our last interview, you mentioned that there were several workshops that were being planned. Some had taken place already and others were being planned. And can you give us a little overview of where you had your workshops and how did they go?
Yeah, it's been really interesting to see how in each place, sometimes the workshop was promoted and driven more by the interfaith network in that area. Sometimes it was driven more through one of the disability resource centers in that area. It was for people of faith, disabled, and people who were influential within their faith communities. So non-disabled people and disabled people. We wanted both of those voices so that we would both understand the lived experience and the questions. Christchurch was amazing. That meeting happened right after their Canterbury Interfaith Network. I can't remember the name of their group, but it happened right after their meeting. And so many of their people just remained behind after their meeting and joined this conversation. Dunedin was beautiful. It was mostly facilitated for us by the local Disability Resource Center. It had a lecturer from the University of Otago. It had a beautiful mother and her young adult son who's on the autistic spectrum, and his input, hers as well, was fascinating. We've just had conversations. We've had korero, dialogue. People have shared stories that must have cost them a little bit to share, but they shared them knowing that they will enrich this project. They will make this project that much more useful, and hopefully they will change the norm, for other people in other contexts.
Can you share some stories with us, without disclosing any names or any faith group?
One beautiful young woman who has a beautiful voice. She ended up, she closed our meeting out actually with a beautiful waiata. She had auditioned to be part of a worship team, and the audition went very well. Like I said, she had a beautiful voice. I heard it on the day. And yet they said the faith community that she auditioned with said they would ring her and tell her, which roster she would be put on for the worship team. And in the end, they never rang her. It was potentially too challenging for them to have a young woman with a beautiful voice who was also blind.
Oh, but there are a lot of famous blind singers.
Exactly. So a lack of imagination in that case wasn't very helpful. In other places, there were stories of young people who were encouraged to come along to healing events, and these buildings didn't think they needed to have ramps or any kind of accessibility features, because if you came along to this particular faith community and they prayed for you and you were healed, then ramps and accessibility features would no longer be important. So they didn't want to undermine their theology of healing by adding ramps and other accessibility. It was just fascinating to see the theology of healing totally at odds with the theology of hospitality.
So do you think it was not a neglect, it was on purpose that they thought it would be best if there was no ramp because you're positive and you will be walking back?
Yes. So then when those young people were not healed, they had to be helped out of the building again in their wheelchair. They had to be lifted out. They couldn't just leave of their own accord. So in a way, they were prisoners. But on the other hand, they had to be helped out, and then they, got into the van, maybe with their family or whatever. And there was no conversation on the way home. There was no joy, because the family maybe again felt humiliation and shame because things hadn't gone in the public space, in the community, the way it had been anticipated. It's very discouraging. Another example came from a beautiful Baha'i man, and he said, we meet in a council facility, and it's not very accessible anymore because things have changed about the car park and things. And he says, but that is what it is. He says, but we had a beautiful woman who came along to our meetings regularly, and we knew she was having trouble with her hearing. And then she hasn't been coming along to the meetings for some months now. And it's because we didn't amplify the spoken parts of our meetings. We did not show hospitality to her. And he says, I'm ashamed to admit that here today. He just realized it in the course of our conversation. And I can only think that he will have gone back and done something about that. So change is already happening just because the conversations were happening, and the project hasn't even really been implemented. So
it's if you are not in the situation where you need special conditions, then I think that it's often that you overlook it. And yes. I remember one disabled person told me that she wanted to go to an event, and they had a ramp, that everything prepared. There were no steps to the place, but the parking was on the other side of the road, and it was a busy road. And it was a struggle for her to get from the other side of the road to the building. And
discouraging.
So you really have to think of everything. She said maybe they thought that everybody with disability would be taken just in front of the building and then can go in. Everything was prepared. But she said she's disabled, but she can drive, and she wants to park her car. And the only way to park it is on the other side of the road.
Years ago, I heard a man talk about Cummins diesel engine, manufacturing of the Cummins engine. And he said that apprentice engineers all had to go and work in the workshop for a couple of weeks on rotation, so they would understand how much room was needed for a hand. And at that time, it was generally assumed to be a man's hand, a man's hand and a spanner to go into those different spaces to be able to repair the engines, because the designers of the engines weren't always taking into consideration the users, the maintenance that would need to happen down the road. So I've often thought that at the university and in different places, we need the architects, the landscapers, the designers, and the engineers to get in a wheelchair or to use crutches and go from the furthest extreme of the campus to the other extreme and up and down in every building and use all of the toilets. I don't know the number of times since we've been doing this project that I've noticed that you may have a disability toilet, or should I say accessible toilet. I'm still getting the language right. Excuse me for if I've offended, but an accessibility toilet. But the toilet tissue, the toilet paper or whatever is totally impossible, to reach. And to move her around in an accessibility toilet in a manual chair is different from some of the bigger motorized chairs. And so to think about all of these things, it can be a little bit daunting, but if we do this in co-design with people with various impairments, it's not rocket science. We just have to include the people most affected in the process and in the decisions.
Jill, I was just thinking that you would mention the word include now.
Let's include them in the conversation.
We have to have them all on board.
Yeah.
That everybody the architect, the designer, the builder, and the person for whom it is meant, they belong together at the table to discuss it together to make a project of their own. Because otherwise, as you say, you'll miss a point and you think it's all fine. Yeah, we've done all the checks, but
therein, even in our languaging, when we talk about we, us, and them, it should all be us.
Yeah.
If we meaning faith communities, organizations, people who try to make things happen and make a more socially cohesive, society, if we made sure that around every table there were a variety of ages, ethnicities, genders, abilities, if around every decision-making team, every leadership team, that's one of the things we've learned in the project too. Many of the people with disabilities say that when we go along to a temple, a synagogue, a gurdwara, a mosque, church, whatever, we don't often see people who look like us up on the stage leading. We don't see people with disabilities. Now, there are hidden disabilities as well, so we're not going to see all of them. But often we don't see people with disabilities up at the front in the photos representing the faith communities in any way. And it kind of tells us who is welcome and who's not welcome. If the retail people are getting it right in their advertising as they're trying to sell things, surely the faith communities, who should be so much more altruistic in their people focus, surely we can pay better attention to make sure our values are expressed. Yeah.
I remember very well, that I'm German, and I remember very well I think it was in 1990s, early 1990s or so, when one of our top politicians was attacked with a knife and then ended up in a wheelchair. And he stayed in parliament, and they had to adapt everything. They had to put ramps. This speaker lectern had to move up and down, and they never thought of anything like that. But it was decided he stays if he wanted to be part of the parliament, and he stayed and there for decades. But through this attack, so many things changed.
That's fascinating, because what that says is that previous to them, and I don't know my history very well, but previous to then, nobody who used a wheelchair had ever run for office or been elected to be in that context. It was an acquired disability that triggered the change.
Yes.
Yeah. And so that's another thing I've learned about too. People who are born with a disability or a degenerative disease or condition, over time creates the disability. That's a different context and sometimes a different conversation than those with an acquired disability. And sometimes those with the acquired disability can be quite the catalyst for accessibility and for equity and whatever, but only after they're experiencing this disability. Lived experience is so educational.
Absolutely.
and sometimes embarrassing.
Jill, tell me what would you see as the kind of results? What are you taking out for the reporting? Because as I mentioned in the beginning, you're funded by the MST, you're supported by several organizations and with Yes Disability, etc. So you have all the support. So I assume that you would have to report back to everyone. Can you give us some highlights what you would report to your funders and supporters?
Yeah, reports can be well presented and very exciting, or they can be as dull and boring as all get out, as you and I both know. So one of the things that I'm very concerned about, we talk about accessibility for people with disabilities, but I also want to make our findings very accessible within our reporting procedure. So the website, inclusivefaithproject.org.nz, yep. The website will have quite a lot of resources. It will have summary and an executive summary kind of a thing of our findings. But I think one of the best things is the stories, both that we've heard in the multiple hui that we've done since the end of June in all the major cities up and down the country. So the stories that we've heard there, but also what's going to come out of some of the prototype initiatives that we will implement hopefully this year, where we will have a mosque who will say, we want to implement change to make hospitality and belonging for people with disabilities the norm in our mosque. The same in a gurdwara, in a church, in a temple somewhere. The reporting out of some of that, what we learn in these prototype setups, is also going to be quite valuable. The reporting has to be done, of course, for the funders and the government agencies. I get that, but I'm more into the practical outcomes, the fruit of the project. So that's really more my side of it.
And Jill, when you look at the website, we'll put the website up on our website also, and there is on the homepage there is this quote: "Full participation means everyone is included," and which is
maybe we should change that. Means everyone belongs.
We are all together in the same boat.
Yeah, we should change that.
But also there are not many resources with sign language. What do you say about that?
Yeah, you are so true. You have identified a glaring hole, gap in our project so far. We wanted to launch the website in time for the International Day for Disabled Peoples. Did I get that right? Sometimes I jumble those words a little bit. And that was the 3rd of December. And so we wanted to launch the website that day. But as you know, when you get into December and everybody's projects are all coming down to the end and everybody has their reports to write by the end of the year, we couldn't get New Zealand Sign Language interpreters available at that point. We couldn't get some of the captioning that we wanted available at that time. So that is a huge hole that we must fill. We do have a podcast on the website, so there is something there for those who are have visual impairments that they can listen to the podcast. But that is a landing space right now, that website, and it is going to be populated with so much stuff, in this coming year. There will be resources there, both for people with disabilities who would like to walk with their influencers in their faith community to effect change. And then there will be heaps of resources as well for faith leaders or influencers, who want to do this proactively themselves. And one of the things that I hope will happen in lots of faith communities across New Zealand is they will actually write accessibility responsibilities into roles for their youth leaders, their children's coordinators, their family people, their social services people. Everybody actually in the organization will have something that will jog their minds and think, is this accessible? How do I make sure that a young person can go on this camp or this outing or this event? And actually to write it into job descriptions so that each faith community has an advocate. Then somebody rocks up to the church with children who are have some behavioral challenges because of a condition or autism or whatever. Then they have somebody they can go to, and that person will say, this is not too hard. You are very welcome here, because some of the stories we've heard, parents will rock up. They want their kids to grow up and have a faith. The family needs the resources of a spiritual support and all of that, but it gets to be too hard. And so we want to make it where it's not too hard for anybody, but everybody can belong.
I think that what you also said, what you just mentioned with the behavioral problem, that's another big issue, because if you have a behavioral problem, it's not visual. You can't see it. You can see the action, but you can't see that it is not, that it's something that you can't just change by your own will.
Exactly. And to somehow, and I don't mean to challenge you, but to somehow change our vocabulary a little bit, it's not a problem.
Yes. Oh my God, we have to change the language so much.
Yeah, it's not a problem. It just is. And how do we work with this beautiful child and learn from this child, as well as this child bless the faith community in whatever way they're supposed to? How can that create more empathy and mercy and grace and joy, understanding,
and the right attitude to what you can do? And that again needs education, because if the parents would know, because they have the daily experience, but other people in the community might not know how to behave, and they might do something that is really wrong in the moment without knowing.
Yeah, they didn't realize it. They didn't know. Yeah, but we just have to celebrate, the diversity, because within that diversity, it enriches community. We can all learn from each other, and we all have different roads. And I think, as I said in our previous interview, I'm not getting younger. I'm only getting older. And the list of things I cannot do is getting a little bit longer. So we all should, I don't want to should on people, but we all should pay more attention to disability and accessibility, because we are an aging community as well.
Thank you so much, Jill. I think that is a wonderful way to finish this interview, because you bring us the thought to ourselves to think about if we were in the shoes of needing more support, what would we wish for? So thank you so much, Jill.
Very welcome. Thanks for having me.